Okay, hi. We'd like to welcome everybody to our monthly Quali webinar. I'm Michelle Bates. I'm the Vice President of Marketing here at Quali, and I'm excited to be part of this webinar today. All attendees are going to be on mute throughout the presentation. We'll open everything for Q&A at the end of the panel discussion, but you can feel free to type any questions you have into the Q&A feature as they come to you, and we'll make sure to write them down and get them set to answer. You can do that by hovering over the bottom of your Zoom window and clicking the Q&A button. We will go through as many questions as we can in the time that we have allotted. The webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with everybody, as well as our entire Quali community of users via our monthly newsletter. So feel free to share the link out with your colleagues who couldn't meet here with us today. We do like to make sure everybody has the chance to watch when they can. So before we dive into our discussion today, I'm really excited to take a moment to introduce our panelists. We're really grateful for them taking the time out of their schedule to be with us today. All of them have a really great background in what we're going to talk about. So the first person is Sarah Baumholt. She is Adobe's campaign lead on the Creative Cloud Enterprise for higher education. She joined Adobe in the fall of 2016 to develop and lead the marketing programs for higher education institutions. Before joining Adobe, Sarah spent over a decade working in higher education marketing, where she led student acquisition and retention campaigns for institutions all across the country. Sarah's a graduate from Westminster College here in Utah, where she got her MBA in business administration with a marketing emphasis. In her free time, she enjoys spending time with her family, yoga, reading, baking, and supporting local theater. Bobby Babra comes to us as a managing partner from Flip ED LLC. Bobby is an operating and advising executive in software, ed tech, and talent tech, working to bridge the skills and talent divide between education and employment. Currently, he is an advisor to private equity and venture funds focused on K-12, higher ed, and workplace education sectors. He is actively working on the impact of machine learning and AI on future jobs and upskilling strategies at scale. Most recently, Bobby was Chief Digital Officer at Penn Foster, which is the leading education and training platform for middle-skilled workers, where he led digital platform strategy and operations to reach over 150,000 adult learners. Prior to that, Bobby has led several innovative and transformation initiatives for major learning platform companies. And finally, we have Jess Mitchell. Jess is a senior manager for research and design at the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD University in Toronto, which she assures us is a meaningless title that tells you virtually nothing about her, but here's what you need to actually know. Jess is a misfit. She values critical perspective and appreciates the messy parts of human interaction. Additionally, she has a fondness for things in threes and a background in ethics. So we are very excited to have all of these guys on board for today's discussion. It's going to bring a wealth of information to what we want to talk about. This is the most requested panel we've had so far this year, and so I'm really excited to be a part of it today. So I want to start out with a kind of simple question, but it's a question that matters to so many people, and everybody wanted us to ask it, so we'll start here. How is digital nativism, as well as just the change in overall consumer digital learning habits, changing the way universities have to work with students, and why does this matter?
Well, I'll go. You know, if you think about the way students are really entering this college experience, it's really that they are technology consumers, and they're not really these technology experts that we think they are in terms of digital tools. And it's not so much about knowing how to use these digital tools as they enter. It's really about learning sort of the soft skills that happen when they understand how to use technology. So things like how to collaborate, how to be critical thinkers, how they can really be creative in the output that they're doing, as well as just even creative problem solving. And so I really like to think about this in terms of giving some examples. So if you think about an educator and providing a project around a social issue as an example, and then telling the students, let's communicate this in 5 modes, rather than doing a traditional paper and showing what their knowledge is. So they could do something like creating a video where they have to figure out what are the images and what is the sound and narrative that I need to explain this social issue and the outcomes and impact that it has on our environment, as an example. And then they could think about creating a podcast and the audio that needs to go into that when you don't have you don't have the visual and the additional images that support it, they have to think a little bit differently about how they communicate that narrative within that podcast. And then they could think about how they would do an infographic that they could use in, say, social media, where they have to put all of these images and data and research and points together in a fashion that people can actually read and understand and follows and tells a story. And finally, they could look at putting together like an app or a website that really helps communicate the additional information and provides the user with a one-stop shop. So when you give students an opportunity to think differently about how they communicate their projects and their activities within the classroom, they're really exploring things in a different way and allowing themselves to create these additional soft skills that they'll need for the future workforce.
I'm really glad that you're talking about the soft skills and not just taking a look at the technology. The question is leading in a good way, though, that we can critique. I think we are making a lot of assumptions about who these students are. And when we talk about students, who are we talking about? Are we talking about the typical liberal arts, very small college, or the enormous university where you're one of 30,000, or are we talking about a community college experience, or are we talking about some other learning experience and lifelong learners? I think that what's exciting to me about asking that question and sort of poking at some of our assumptions about who students are is, just what you're alluding to, Sarah, this notion that we need to create critical thinkers and critical minds and curiosity and foster that kind of thinking, that it's not about the technology. Universities seem to be always thinking about centralization and decentralization, about which technology to sign on to, what kind of MOU should they have, or should they remain sort of unapologetically open source and stay away from making commitments. Those are all questions about the tools that we're going to be using in the teaching or in the learning. But we're at a time when the central tools may be less important than, as you're, I think, alluding to again, Sarah, the tools that are out there, meeting people where they are. So students, for instance, are using YouTube as a search engine. That's not something that we're talking a lot about in our well-meaning reports about the state of the university and the state of the students coming in. I just lost 2 of my 3 internet connections because there's a thunderstorm coming through right now. We're all in different contexts, and the learning and the teaching and the experience of both of those is going to create challenges. The opportunity that we have as people who are educators, or as people who are interested in the technology to reach educators, or to build the content to reach educators, we have an opportunity to make it multimodal and to make it not dependent on any particular platform, not dependent on any particular assumption we're making about the student, their means of expressing their ideas, or the way that they've learned a particular concept, and the way that that's delivered. This gives us a lot of opportunities to do things differently and to be open to doing them differently, instead of sort of signing on to the do this one way, express yourself in the way that works best for you, according to your needs and your preferences and the places that you feel as though you're most native digitally or not.
Yeah, let me comment on that a little bit. Building on Jess's point about meeting the learner where they are. At Penn Foster, we're serving 170, 150,000 middle-skilled working adults, and so when we map out, the demographic of who we're serving and the profile of the learner that is entering universities. When we study that, we're talking about, close to 45, 46% of these students being 24 years and of age and older. Close to 56% of them are working adults, and close to 30% of them are parents. Close to 40% of them are first generation attendees of college. So when you look at the psychograph of this individual, I think you have to start with that and then try to meet them where they are, to Jess's point. And so, digital is one way, but one of the things that we found in our research, building this very vast learning profile of the populations that we serve, and we're Penn Foster is a purely online institution, is that there is a shift towards a blended modality, because this demographic that we're serving needs what we refer to as tech and touch, and the touch aspect of them is just as important as the pure digital native experience that we often aspire to provide them. And so I think balancing tech and touch, whether it's the best of an online community experience, being able to attend graduation and convocation, a highly scalable student success center that takes the friction out of the going to university experience. These are the types of sort of pain points outside of the academic and learning experience, which also has a series of innovations that I believe are important. You touched on a few, so I won't be repetitive. For example, the soft skills. As AI and ML start to penetrate the workforce, we have to strive harder to be uniquely human. And what are those uniquely human skills that are going to allow us to be compatible with machines is many of those things that you talked about, Jess, like creativity, problem solving, collaboration, teamwork, etc. So yeah, I think it's a very multifaceted, and we have to take sort of a broad-based perspective on when we think about how to create better outcomes for learners, and it goes far beyond the use of technology as a medium to deliver instruction. I think the last thing I'll comment, and then we move on, is the shift from disseminating information and knowledge to providing workplace-oriented competencies and skills and assessing those. And I think that that's another vast area that we have to sort of strive for, and deliver that at scale through an online medium is yet to be solved. So these are all sort of opportunities as we think about serving the adult learner.
Can I jump in there and just respond to Bobby quickly? Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So Bobby, you did a lovely thing just then. You started at the big picture, and you started talking about the demographic profile of the students, and sort of what the data is showing you, who these people are, what their experiences are, and it's a little bit about the constraints that they might be experiencing. And then you dove into the tech and touch, which basically says, okay, so you got a general idea of who we're talking about, but now you're acknowledging that people need different things, and some people need more of the touch, some people need less of the touch and more of the tech. One of the things that we worry about in the Inclusive Design Research Center is when we start to think about big data, or we start to make data-driven decisions. It's not that data-driven decisions are a bad idea, but it's that you don't stop at just data. You have to do what Bobby just described, and that is drill into an individual learner. If you're looking at SDG number 4 from the UN Social Development Goals, to reach every single learner, we really have to be quite creative about this and quite critical about this, and not think of students as large demographics in this very abstract way, but rather sort of get down to some fundamental principles about teaching and learning, and why are we doing this, and how can we do this so that everybody receives an education. At the IDRC, we take this as an opportunity to have a critical perspective on the whole pipeline of education, including the assessments and the preparation for the workplace. Education, by and large, is standardized everybody gets the same education. This is what we think is a way to achieve fairness. Everybody gets the same exam, they get the same assessments, they're graded against each other in the same way. But we know that the workplace is not interested or demanding people who are the same. We need people who are creative, people who are innovative, people who can take risks and can be explorative in what they're doing, people who are wonderers and thinkers and doers, and all of these combinations of things. So again, we have this kind of gap where we're not reaching everybody. We know we're not accomplishing SDG number 4. And we know that technology is not the silver bullet that's going to get us there. I think about, anecdotally, somebody at our university was talking about how only a few students make use of the video recorded lectures that we put online. You know, he was saying this is it's such a waste. There's such an expenditure. So well, wait a minute, right? Just because 2 or 3 students use that doesn't mean that's a waste. If we're going to take seriously SDG number 4 and everybody has access to education, then we can't look at this as just a numbers game. And are we getting a bang for our buck in terms of education? Those 3 students who saw that video might not have had access to the content or to the learning module otherwise. So I think that there are ways that we can be quite critical of education and how education is happening and how it is leaving people behind and still leaving people behind in spite of all of our innovations, in spite of all of our technologies. And I think, Bobby, you're sort of alluding to that and getting to that with this tech and touch idea. I quite like that.
Yeah, yeah, there's,
a bit.
go ahead.
And it's up for anybody, but Jess brings up one of the biggest questions I've had over my career, because I've worked with a lot of non-traditional students, is that we keep hearing from universities that they're kind of looking for that magic bullet, right? So what is the one thing that I can do to reach this new generation? How is digital nativism changing? And what is the one thing I can do to really approach that? And for me, it deals with what you guys were just talking about, which is a multimodality, that there isn't a silver bullet, that it requires a lot of different ways of getting at different kinds of people. And I'd love for you guys to explore that even a little bit more and what you've seen with the different populations you work with, because I've had a lot of conversations with people about there isn't a silver bullet. We're moving into a generation where we have to look at lots of different avenues and lots of different touch points in order to reach our objectives. And I'd love to know if you guys agree with that or what you've seen in relationship to that and how it plays a role in what universities are up against right now.
I can take a crack at that. So, you know, to your point, it's multifaceted. It's complex. So there is no single answer. But I can tell you from, you know, from studying the landscape and sort of looking for opportunities where we can create less friction in this whole sort of value chain. If you think of it as a value chain. The area that sort of, you know, I think is most interesting is the alignment of incentives and talent flow between education and employment. And as we start to cultivate learners for very clear career pathways and outcomes, where so that's one. Second, where the economic incentives are aligned for the education provider and for the employer to either co-invest or co-sponsor the outcome for that learner. I think the economic incentives, along with the alignment of workplace skills, I think ultimately solves for some of the friction that we're facing, because ultimately this is a budget-constrained ecosystem. We could all do all the fancy things that we all have ideas about and we have great innovation around. But our only constraint is economics, and it's not motivation, it's not intent, it's not you know, the desire to create purpose and impact. And so, really, if you boil it, you know, if you take it at the high level, if we can solve for the economics around it with better employment outcomes, sponsorship, education as a benefit, income share agreement, these to me are like the true innovations that are going to create, more, remove more friction in the process and allow us to invest, how should I say, more judiciously in creating better learning outcomes for the learners. But that's just to kick us off. Those are some of my thoughts around that.
I'd even add, when you think about the changes that we're talking about today that need to happen, and to Jess's point earlier, that everything is so standardized, part of that is because it makes it really easy for educators to figure out, how to bucket people, right? And who rise to the top and who are kind of middle, and grade all of the papers, whatever it may be. When the changes we're talking about really you start to have a lot of questions around, okay, well, if I'm changing the way that we are teaching, if I'm integrating new tools into the curriculum, how do I look at grading these assignments now? What really constitutes a really good project versus a really bad project? And what kinds of technology should I be allowing my students to use? And how often and which classes am I just talking about core like design classes, or am I talking about all disciplines and humanities and sciences and so it starts to really open up this discussion, at, even on a bigger scale, about how these faculty members can really change the way that they're teaching. So there's no right answer or wrong answer, but there's just more to this than just us saying, you need to really change the way that you're doing things, but it's like, how do you actually do that and put that into practice? So there's a lot of discussion around that as well.
That's a great point. The good news and the bad news is that it's everything. So as Bobby said, this is an economic issue. It's not just the economics of what's happening in the classroom. It's the food insecurity of the students. It's who shows up to class with a full belly. It's how much are they spending on the textbooks that they need to do the learning. And it stretches all the way, as you're saying, Sarah, into pedagogy. How are we engaging them? It stretches to assessment. I mean, no kidding, right? Not just are we doing standardized teaching, we're doing standardized assessment because it's easier and it's quicker. And let's face it, if you follow the capital, this is the enterprise of education. You can scale it, right? You can teach a 101 course to thousands of students, and presumably they'll all have the same learning outcome. This is sort of, if we follow the capital and we see where the capital pops up, it's in textbook costs, it's in costs to run the university, it's in some of these structural costs. And we've got instructors who are precariously employed. So we've got adjunct faculty, we've got sessionals here in Canada, we've got people who have no chance of tenure and have hundreds and hundreds of students and a grading or assessment challenge in front of them that is pretty much insurmountable. These are big issues, and these are not going to be solved by a bullet, silver, or otherwise. It's not going to be solved by one particular thing. It's going to be solved by a reimagining of all of these things. And there are people doing this, and I think that it can be a little bit overwhelming and feel like a fire hose, or it can be, let's start with some small steps and let's change some of these things. So for example, if anybody's been in the position as an educator of writing recommendations for their students, they know that they're in a position at that point to differentiate among their students. Let's say you have 3 students. Each of them can build a sound structure, but some of them are better at group work than others. And so when you're writing those letters of recommendation for students, I think what you're getting at is something that it gets back to Sarah's original point. This is the soft stuff. So if you can build a bridge, great. But if you can't collaborate with the civic leaders in the space, you can't collaborate with the community, you can't collaborate with the builders and build a relationship with all of these people, you're not going to be an A-level bridge builder in comparison with somebody else. So it's about putting these skills into practical practice. which should give us some insight into the ways that we are doing assessment and ways we can do it differently. There are some things that absolutely need to be assessed. Yes, they can do it. No, they cannot do it. In the cases of things that don't need to be assessed in that way, we are still assessing them in that way. And I think that we can be much more creative. Now, of course, this gets to the economics of education. You can't scale that if you're one instructor and you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students. So, right, there's a lot that I think that this conversation brings up. If we're earnest and genuine about trying to reach this goal of educating everyone, and we know that education at this point is not for everyone. We know we're leaving people behind, and the people that we're leaving behind are the people who are in many cases doubly marginalized. You know, it's somebody with a disability who already has to spend more, has to expend more to just be at the same level as someone else. And then on top of that, they come into a learning environment where maybe the content does not meet their learning needs. And they're seen as sort of an extra or an other, as somebody has to put technology together or put the content together to meet their needs in a special way. Instead, we've got to flip the way that we're thinking about all of these things, right? It's not an enterprise. We haven't built a company of education. Why aren't we trying to solve backwards from the social development goal and say, well, how could we reach everybody? It becomes a puzzle. It becomes an ethical problem that we can all start to talk about in earnest ways. And yes, it doesn't have a black or white answer. Most ethical issues have gray space. So I think that that's, to me, where this opportunity and where the exciting parts are.
I really appreciate that, Jess. And I think it brings up something. So for those of the people that are listening to the webinar, they're probably thinking right now, all that stuff is true. I'm totally overwhelmed. I don't have enough resources. My class load is huge. What have you guys seen in this space in terms of how people are utilizing technology, even to solve small pieces of these problems that you think is inventive, that you found to be helpful? Is there anything that you guys could bring to the table to share with our listeners that you've seen that kind of sparked your interest, where you thought that's an innovative and out of the box way of kind of approaching this problem? Definitely not solving it, but approaching it.
I can take that. I'd say what worked well for us in a very measurable way is our switch to competency-based learning. That was a big shift to make for these many students at scale. But we found that we were able to improve learning outcomes by about 10 percentage points. We were able to increase exam velocity, something that we measured, the rate at which students are taking exams and quizzes, by about 18%. And I know these percentages to you don't make sense until I give you real numbers, but we're talking about a very large population of students across 56 programs, and I don't have the stats broken down at the top of my head by program. But I would say that, if we looked at, and we were a very data-driven analytical organization because it's a self-pay program. Students don't take Title IV funding. And so the unit economics of what we do makes, is everything to us because you're dealing with very small dollars. So small percentages improvements mean big things to us. And so in a nutshell, the move to competency-based learning had an internal rate of return and a payback within 3.5 years because we were able to increase LTV, which is lifetime value of the learner, by the proportionate amount that we invested in the shift to the technology, and also the cost of migrating the curriculum to be competency-based. So of all the things that I've tried that I can share with you, and the one has sort of at-scale measured impact is that. The second is relying on data analytics to be able to provide very targeted intervention to at-risk students at the point where they are starting to struggle behind either on their payments, their motivation, or just academics. So the idea is to always measure a learner on 3 dimensions: motivation, academics, and financial risk, and be able to anticipate where in their student journey they are at risk of falling behind on any one of those 3, and to be able to intervene. And as you can imagine, if we can do this, proactively using data, it creates, if we can get that student to even take 1 more course or 2 more courses, that puts them further along on their journey to completion, which ends up being, the self-fulfilling prophecy in of itself. So those are the 2 things that I would say has had extremely high ROI in my experience.
I love. Can I just tack on to what Bobby was saying?
Oh, please do, both of you. Yeah.
I love the fact that you're talking about competency-based, and but more importantly, even you talked a lot about the common denominator of retaining, right, and engaging these students. And when you think about how to keep students engaged, I think that's even a bigger question that institutions are really thinking about, because we talked a little bit about it earlier on, and no longer can we just have sort of the typical type of environment where students come to class and it's the same lecture that they, it's done over year, and students need to think and learn differently. And part of it is really equal access and giving these students the opportunity to have access to a variety of tools, a variety of ways to learn. To Jess's point earlier, even if it's only 3 of them that really listen to those videos, giving that opportunity to these students and helping them really gain that success, that's what's going to keep them engaged in their studies, in their environment, regardless of whether they're young, old, somewhere in between, regardless of the type of student that they are. I think the fundamental thing is really about engagement and how we can really keep them engaged in the content they're learning, in the projects that they're doing, and help kind of push them towards that final graduation date.
I would really agree with that, Sarah. One of the coolest things I've seen, and I won't say which university it is, but it's a university we used to work with really closely at my previous job. But the engagement that they were able to do between the students who are online learning students, where they would create forums and areas for them to learn from each other outside of the classroom. A lot of those students had a hard time engaging with the professor, the teacher. They were students who'd already dropped out before, who were coming back to school to relearn. But they found that engagement with other students to be a huge facilitator of success and camaraderie. So even though they're not in the classroom, they were able to find a way. It's again that tech and touch that you were talking about earlier, Bobby, like finding ways of joining those 2 things together. And their retention rates were through the roof because students had multiple ways of getting the information they needed. I found that to be fascinating. I don't know if you've come across stuff, Jess, you want to share?
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe curveball here, but what you're all saying, but nobody said, is what I hear, like when you ask somebody about their experience in education, somebody had an impact, a moment that had an impact. I mean, 10 times out of 10 in my I don't know, many times of asking this, it's always been a person. It's been, there was that person, there was that teacher who said, I believe in you, or I think you can do this, or why don't you try this? It was that person, and then the individual's trajectory it began. So we know that success is about opportunities, and by and large, you need that one opportunity to then build on more opportunities. They beget more of the same. So what's interesting, I've never, I mean, this is a straw man statement I'm going to make, but I've never heard somebody say, a piece of technology changed my learning future, changed my life. It made me who I am today. It's always a person that had an intervention. It's always somebody who inspired or connected. And to your point, sometimes it's peers, sometimes it's a mentor. It has nothing to do with the particular learning environment. Often it's a teacher. It's somebody who notices something. And those are the people who I think are not algorithm driven or data driven. They're the people who feel something. So they may be the teacher who sees somebody who's struggling, who's not meeting the marks, and who wonders why, and finds out that it has nothing to do with the person's intellect or their ability to learn, but has to do with something completely different, like maybe the format of the content or the learning environment that the person is in. Maybe they're being bullied and they can't, how well can you learn in an environment where you're being bullied or you're being marginalized? So there are all these social factors that come into this. The piece that I think most broadly I can see having a pretty enormous impact on education and the rethinking of education has been open education. And when I say that, I mean open education resources, OERs, open textbooks, but also open pedagogy, open assessments, open open science, open data. It's the open, and it's not all that different from any of our positions. It's this sort of perspective shift where instead of thinking of something in terms of completion, you're thinking in terms of how can it be improved? How can you be curious about the ways that what you're doing are having an impact on something else? And this is the design of education, right? So thinking about ways to do that, one of the advantages I think of open education at large is approaching it from a very modular perspective. Instead of pre-packaging, here's this boxed version of biology 101 and then send it out to everybody, there is an opportunity for engagement. There's an opportunity for students to have agency in making decisions about assessments and being engaged in assessments and creating question banks, in doing peer assessments, which is this wonderful skill that, if you want to create the critical minds that Sarah's talking about, we've got to actually build those skill sets, including critique, productive critique and assessment. So there are all of these ways that technology does not necessarily solve, but people solve. And I see a lot of this happening in open education and the sort of sub-disciplines, I suppose, of open education as well.
Great.
Oh, sorry. I'm just going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the people that are on. But just piggybacking off what you just said there, Jess, what I'm really interested in maybe having you guys just talk about it, about and from what I'm hearing from you about so you now human and engage better with students and I don't think that people think of technology as a facilitator of personal engagement, but from everything you guys are saying, that's the best way to utilize a lot of this technology for more digital native students coming up, is as a way to even create more of a connection between the university and the student, or the teacher and the student, or the students with the students. And I was just wondering if there's anything you could add to the importance of utilizing technology in a humanizing way for those that are listening.
I actually think it's really important that these students are building their own brands, right? So they're trying to, once they graduate, they have to differentiate themselves within the market. And when they go to interview, who are they? It no longer can we really rely on just a resume to explain, what we've done. Being able to show and have their the person they're interviewing with experience the work that they've done within their educational classes, whether that's through an e-portfolio or whatever it may be, showing some other examples. But I think also really building that brand is really important. And so allowing students to explore, whether it's in a maker space or some sort of a smart classroom, and they're able to communicate differently and really fail and succeed through a variety of ways. I mean, there's, the world is changing with AI and AR and VR. I mean, they're going to have to know and understand technology in a different way, excuse me, than we do right now, right? And so even just allowing them to have opportunities to come together as students and collaborate on things and then see where that takes them. I think it's important to have those opportunities.
I'm going to give Bobby the chance to go last to have the final word. So I'm going to go next.
Okay.
I love what you just said, Sarah, because isn't that what education is about? Trying things, seeing what works. And when we get into this kind of standardized churn, we don't give students an opportunity to figure out what works for them. There's so much technology. There's so many choices that need to be made. I think that one of the wonders of education is getting a chance to explore all of those things and see what works best for you, right? As you said, sort of create your brand, but also just sort of understand how you learn best. In what circumstances do you do better? Is it you know, that being in a classroom full of hundreds of people is useful to you because then maybe you can chat with people after class? Or is it more useful for you to be in a very quiet environment and watch the video after you've had a chance to read the material? Like, you get to choose your own adventure, but to choose your own adventure, you need to have an opportunity to choose different modes and to have all of those things available to you. That's what I think is the sweet spot of technology. We have the ability to make all of those modes, and you have the ability to try them out and see what works as a student. And then you have the ability to revisit that, but also consume content in that way and learn in that way. I mean, you look at the success of things like the PhET simulations or Khan Academy. You know, you've got all these different ways of learning, and you're letting the student or the individual express what works best for them, giving them agency, building skills when doing the giving them agency, and giving them an opportunity to critique in some technological forums, right? And doing it in a much more public way than just within their class. I think that there's a tremendous role for technology in this. I don't think it's technology solving things. I think it's empowering people more.
That's great comments. I agree with everything said. Just the only thing I can think of adding is the idea that I feel like there hasn't been any sort of meaningful innovation in instructional design and how we teach through a blended medium, both the dissemination of knowledge and information, but also skills that we talked about, soft and hard. So one technique that is, I think, very interesting that frankly I don't have any data on in terms of who's using it effectively and how, etc. But something that I personally am very interested to see is this notion of active learning. And active learning as a means of sort of incorporating ideas and notions like debates, role playing, guided analysis, and these types of techniques to really get an immersive learning experience, and some of those soft skills that we talked about, but also combining the hard skills in with the soft skills. So this integrated approach, experiential approach, which frankly I don't believe can be done solely in a digital medium. It has to be done in some form of a blended medium. But I feel like that is probably the best next sort of steps of innovation and opportunity for us to create even better learning outcomes and prepare learners for workplace skills, basic, uniquely human skills, and have them be more well-rounded individuals, as they enter the workforce. I don't know if I'd love to hear if someone else has had any experience with active learning or pursuing that as a pedagogical design principle.
I mean, there are all of these frameworks. There's a framework a year and trends, but there's a lot of work going on in open pedagogy right now and open digital pedagogy, where sort of considering the impact of the technology on the learning. I did a bit of this with a group, and it was really interesting. We were talking about a medium like this. We were using, we might not have been using Zoom, but we were using something similar. And we were talking about how it changes the interaction, the impact it has on the way that we express ourselves and the way we relate with each other. You know, there is this practice, for instance, of muting yourself when you're in this kind of an environment, especially when there are a lot of people there. Even when there aren't a lot of people, a lot of times people will mute themselves. And it's kind of fascinating to think about it from a feminist perspective. You know, you've got like 100 years of feminism, and now all of a sudden you've got technology and you've got people muting themselves, literally muting their voice and disengaging from what's happening in front of them. You know, you can see the person who's sort of glancing somewhere else. You can see if they're typing. You can see that kind of distracted engagement. And I think that what's interesting to me about that kind of critical digital pedagogy is thinking about the ways, and it has an overlap actually with inclusive design, is thinking about what are those cross-cutting things. So for instance, if we were in person, Bobby, you know, we would be gesturing to each other, we'd be interrupting each other in this sort of natural conversational way. When we're here, it takes on a very different sort of rhythm. The conversation has a different rhythm because it's much harder to do that in this sort of synchronous way. But to think about the impact on your ideas and your thoughts and the way you express yourself in a situation like this. For instance, online conversations, there's often long, awkward pauses because you're waiting to give somebody an opportunity to talk. That doesn't happen in so much in the face-to-face experiences. You can see people, you can see their bodies, they want to talk, something wants to come out. So there are all of these ways that we've thought about equivalence. So in accessibility, for example, you think about the visual and you think, what would the equivalent experience of the visual experience be for somebody who doesn't have vision? So in the same way, we can think about the equivalent here. Like, what's the equivalent of seeing somebody's body just wanting to say something in a digital environment? We can't get those same cues. So what are those sorts of equivalents, and what do we have to do to achieve this, the kind of interaction and sharing that we might want to have? How do we unmute ourselves in a figurative and quite a literal way in these mediums? I think that those are really exciting and interesting things to talk about.
I think that goes along really well with the audience question that we have that I'd like to piggyback off of, because one of the audience questions we have is, how is the changing way that this up and coming generation is how they live their life? So for example, I have quite a few teenagers, and they do not do some of those things in person that I do. I do bounce when I want to talk, and because I'm more used to that, but they have friends from all over the world that they've known since they were kids, and they're used to that digital exchange. So it's kind of different for them. And so we have some people that are asking, what are some of those changes in behavior with this younger generation? How are we seeing those play out in the learning space? And I think that piggybacks right off what you're saying, Jess. I think there's some changes there, but I love your thoughts on that.
I mean, there's always been a diversity of ways that people are, you know, not everybody bounces when they want to talk, but it's kind of how tuned in are we to each other? And I've seen really, really lovely relationships between people that have been entirely online. No interaction whatsoever. I've seen people sitting next to each other on a couch, you know, sort of texting each other while they're watching a show. It just gives you all of these other ways of interacting. So again, it's up to the individual. What works best for you? One of the things, and I'm reluctant to generalize about an entire group of people or entire generation of people. I think that we do that, and we do it again for simplicity, but I think that we wind up obviously missing a lot of uniquenesses. But one of the things that I think we can say is that for generations that have grown up with technology, there is more of a, why can't I do it this way? approach, which I think is great because I think it pairs nicely with some of what Sarah's talking about. Create your own brand, be a critical mind and critical of what is getting presented to you. So I think that, you know, why can't I have that video of the lecture? Why can't I watch it in the library? Those are fine questions as far as I'm concerned. And wondering about why something isn't available as an outcome of somebody being more digitally sort of comfortable, I think that's great. It's answering the what works for you, and you're familiar with some other ways of doing things that work really nicely for you.
Yeah, I would add too, this generation just really, you know, they really are technology consumers. So everything they do is it's at their fingertips, right? I don't want to generalize either, but you know, I do think that they have a different way of communicating, this generation that's coming in, and they expect that there's opportunities for them to communicate their projects differently than the traditional avenues that we probably have all gone through. And so, you know, and that's probably a much more relevant to this younger generation than some of these learners that are a little bit older and have been in the workforce for a while and are looking just to further their education to be able to grow and succeed within the work environment. But these, you know, these students that are coming in now, a lot of them are social activists. They're looking for opportunities just to share their voice. They want a different type of experience. They want it to be unique to them. They want their educators to provide them an opportunity to communicate in the way that they want to communicate their project. So, you know, these are all really interesting topics and ideas and to figure out, because these students really just want options. You know, they just really want an opportunity to be able to do it in the way that they want to communicate.
I love the idea of that. I think that's the big thing with technology. When we talk to our clients, so for our curriculum and catalog, well, a lot of times when we're talking to universities, it's like, well, your catalog can be published in whatever way is in multiple ways. Like you can be as transparent as you want in the information that's offered in there and how they grade and how they talk about everything. I just feel like options is kind of the operative word for what people are using technology for, giving them more options to express themselves, more options to learn. And I love the idea of that. And I think that's why the magic bullet doesn't work quite so well, because it's not one thing. It's the idea that there's lots of things. And that's kind of a neat, they're lucky, because when I was in college, there were 0 options, big classrooms. And also they did not tell you what you could and could not get a job in, hence the BA in anthropology, the BS in anthropology. I had to go to grad school to fix that one. But Bobby, is there anything that you'd like to add to that conversation in terms of how you're seeing people?
Maybe just share some research data in terms of how when we dissected a lot of our student population and their behaviors and what worked and what not, we found that things vary not so much by digital natives or not digital natives, not so much by age, but things really sort of fluctuate and behaviors varied when you look at sort of different ethnicity background, socioeconomic or first generation learners. When you look at those subgroups, you tend to see correlations in terms of use of technology and how those subgroups take advantage of technology and learning in an online setting. So just to give you a few examples, we found that learners from low-income backgrounds or those that were disadvantaged somehow were all of a sudden more eager to participate in an online medium, to share their thoughts and experiences. Maybe it was because there was less of an inhibition factor. We don't know the why, but we noticed the correlation between those subgroups and they're willing to participate in it more so than if they were put in a classroom setting. And so then maybe there's a confidence thing that or inhibition factor that gets lessened. The other thing we found is that people from diverse backgrounds, ethnicity, race, were more willing to assist other students. So we always encourage students to seek out help from other students online. That's one way we scale our operation. And we found that those subgroups were more willing to help other students than any other cohort or any subgroup. So I guess these are just some examples to not avoid the generalization based on age or digital nativism, but rather sort of look a little bit, one level down to understand and look at the data as to what motivates and incents people to engage, to use Sarah's term, through an online, learning experience.
And I love that you're revealing some of those correlations. That's what the human mind is interested in, is patterns, right? So you look at the data, but then you're still wondering, Bobby, you're saying, well, maybe it has something to do with confidence. We're not sure what the factors are, right? And
yeah.
What's wonderful about people, they're so complex. For instance, somebody who, for whom English is not a first language, may benefit from a less synchronous opportunity to work with others in a forum, for example. There could be tens and 20s, hundreds of reasons why that might work. And I think that it's interesting to look at what works for people and then to wonder why it works and not to wonder.
Well, and we have so many questions we didn't get to, so I think we might try to do a part 2, like in the fall, or maybe do a Koala Days open Q&A panel so you guys can write to us and let us know. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. There's so many good ones. This discussion was so robust and awesome. I appreciate Sarah and Bobby and Jess joining us today so much. We'll do a sum up of the top 5 things we learned from this so that there's a physical piece to it as well. And we'll get the link out to everybody who wasn't able to watch it, and it'll be in the newsletter. But we'd really like to thank our panelists for taking time out of their schedule today. It was such a cool conversation. We appreciate it so much. I hope everybody has a good afternoon, and we'll get everything out to you as soon as we can. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.